Good evening and welcome to the Velocity of Now with me, your host Thomas Sheridan. It's September 1st, 2016, and we're back after a fairly long summer break. I hope you're all keeping well. You had a nice and enjoyable summer. I had a very productive summer, almost at times very stressful, but here we are. We're still alive. We've made it into coming close to the autumnal times of year, best time of year to be alive. And an interesting time of year because it tends to be a pensive and somewhat melancholy in a pleasurable kind of way as the leaves turn brown and people start to think about the onset of winter, the days grow shorter, and it's a good time of year for creativity, I've always personally found. It's also the time of year that the psychopaths start making their plans for the winter, so they start stocking up on extra energy. Psychotics will do this as well. You'll notice that towards the end of September, into October, and into November, the psychopaths and the psychotics will start making major plans. They'll become either incredibly erratic or they will start phenomenal smear campaigns. And it's all about feeding energy for the winter because you're dealing with something basically has no soul. There's nothing in there. And so therefore it has no potential to create a kind of kinetic psychic energy inside themselves. So it has to harvest it from someone else. And its animalistic feral instincts generally kick in around the end of September to early November as they are basically storing it up for the winter. It's a big thing with them. So that's the only bad thing about this point of year. But other than that, it's a wonderful time of year. It's very picturesque. I have a theory that's because the sun is lower in the sky again after being so high. It casts long shadows across the landscape, and it sends shadows along across fields, across buildings, and it creates this almost surreal vista in front of you that not enough people savor it for what it is. Now, in Ireland, we don't get that very long shadowy thing because of our high latitude here. But if you live in sort of like this Midwest, the American Canadian border area, take the Great Lakes, New York across to Washington, Oregon, that area, British Columbia, you do get remarkable long shadows, and conversely in southern Europe in the same regions from like Spain, Portugal, across to Turkey and across to the Middle East at this time of year. And it does turn the landscape into an almost dreamscape, a mystical kind of dreamscape. And this is if you do have a creative nature about you, this is the furnace of creativity. This is the womb of creativity. This is the point where you will actually start to generate new projects, think of new things. This is why also you look at like the big craft stores and art stores. The big sales always happen around this time of year. For that reason, because people are now, they're not spending as much time outdoors. They're going to be indoor a lot more. So the ones who are creatively inclined, artistically inclined, generally begin crafting and arting and writing and all that kind of thing around this time of year. And that's why I love it. I just love this time of year. I always think the baking begins again this time of year. You have the smell of cinnamon and nutmeg and apples and everything, sugar and vanilla in the air because people are starting to bake again. And that's what another aspect about it that's very beautiful. It's very calming. It's very soothing. It's everything that's right with the world and humanity. Now, speaking of things that are right with the world, my book, The Druid Code, is out. It's been out for a month now, and I hope some of you have bought it, are enjoying it. As a book, I'm very proud of. I absolutely love it, and not just because it's my book, because I'm actually going to use it myself. It's actually a handy reference guide and resource guide, and so on. And I'll be talking a little bit about apart from it tonight, which is relevant to tonight's show. And what I've noticed, taking a break from the show and then finishing the book up, I basically went into a sort of like a normal life, doing normal kind of things, just hanging out with friends and doing things and having a laugh and having fun and playing music. And I began to notice the power of synchronicity. When you're absorbed into a project, you tend to miss synchronicity. And this has been a period of incredible synchronicity. I've noticed it everywhere. It's almost like 2016, it's been blooming synchronicities like flowers in a garden. It's really quite remarkable. What does it mean? Well, I don't know for sure, but I do know it's always something important. We've had to deal with horrific terrorist attacks in Europe, due mainly to the fact that European governments are pathetic entities who don't protect their people, who don't seem to think that they think that a diversity program in a university will stop the mass murders of people. This is their defense project. So in the meantime, they're perfectly willing to allow families, men, women, and children, young people, old people, to be slaughtered by jihadists until their social engineering may or may not bear fruit. So the madness is reigning supreme in our governments. It shows the pointlessness of government, how useless and how it has no purpose. Surely, if you live in a nation, right, and you have national borders, without the borders being protected, you do not have a nation. You just don't. You only have a nation as a symbolic idea, but you don't actually have a nation that protects you. And likewise, if you're in the European Union, you're even at more mercy because they don't even want to protect you. They don't even want to protect Europe. It's not even in their interest to protect Europe. Not militarily, not socially, not politically, not even economically. Their only agenda is to culturally and psychologically re-engineer European peoples. And of course, that leads us to the big story of the year, and that was the Brexit vote in England. Now, the Brexit vote in England, yes, I know, at the end of the day, democracy doesn't really mean anything, but there's one aspect of democracy that does mean something, and that's when you can vote in referendums, because a referendum literally gives you a chance to say something that is irrelevant or relevant to the political elite. Therefore, it's coming directly from the masses. You see, people, Democrats and politicians, and I say Democrats, I don't mean Democratic Party in the United States, I mean Democrats in general, people who support democracy, they hate the idea of a plebiscite, because a plebiscite, they don't like the people being allowed to express how they feel. And the last refuge of this in modern democracies is the referendum. Now, we had the Scottish referendum a few years ago, and Scotland voted no to independence by a small majority. Now, that showed the fear factor in the Scottish population, that enough fear had been whipped up to get people to swing the vote to the no side, because they thought that without London they couldn't stand alone. This was how that was done, and things can change very quickly. We saw since Brexit passed in Britain, they're talking now about a Scottish vote and Scotland wanting to get independence. But let me tell you, as an Irish person, an independent Scotland inside the European Union won't be any more free than an independent Ireland is in the European Union. You're just moving from one big boss to the next. If you followed Norway's lead or someone like that, Iceland, it'd be a different story. And this is why I'm deeply distrustful of the Scottish nationalist agenda now, because it seems to be more of a pro-European Union agenda than it is a pro-Scottish independence agenda. So we'll watch that one with a careful eye. But back to Brexit. Now, right before Brexit happened, we had this awful murder of this British politician called Joe Cox in the north of England. Now, I'm not one to be conspiratorially inclined, but I posted on Twitter something like it looked very dodgy. Immediately, a shaming campaign began of anyone who suggested something dodgy had happened with this woman's murder. And it was all done by these fake accounts posting left-wing politics, often extreme left-wing and extreme Marxist viewpoints, even pictures of fascists hanging off lampposts and saying this is what will be done to you. And these people had basically created a shaming list of anyone who suggested any foul play to Joe Cox. And yet, to me, I still cannot get it out of my head. This thing looks very dodgy. And as time passes on, it looks more and more dodgy. We had a politician that no one ever heard of who's murdered and is suddenly spoken about as if they were the greatest statesperson in the history of the world. As if everyone in Britain had always been in love with her. And yet these people who never even heard of her were in convulsions screaming in the streets like wild dogs in fits of hysteria. What happened that was very interesting to me, that was within literally microseconds of the woman's murder, one of her colleagues on the pro-Brexit side in Liverpool, an MEP I believe, posted that the killer had shouted Britain first when he killed her. Then she retracted it after all the newspapers, and of course the Guardian especially, ran with this story. Britain first, Britain first, Britain first killed Joe Cox. This is the whole thing. The whole thing was that she had been murdered for no other reason than to stop the Brexit vote. Now, she was involved in some ridiculous farcical boat ride with that moron Bob Geldof to push through the vote, and yet another woman around him who dies a sudden early death. And suddenly she's a superstar. She was a superstar politician that no one ever heard of. Even people up in the north of England never heard of her. And it just looked, it didn't see, you know, when you see like 9/11, immediately you say to yourself, we're not getting a full story here. Something's not right here. Like the swine flu thing back in 2009, you were like, come on, there's something not right here. It doesn't seem right. So this colleague of hers had said that he'd shout Britain first, the killer. She had given no evidence or proof of this. There was all kinds of conflicting stories coming about what happened during the murder, but immediately the mainstream press and the establishment all around the world ran with the idea that she had been murdered by Britain first because she was full of love for foreigners, and Britain first are full of hate for foreigners. Now, Britain first are a dodgy organisation to begin with. I wouldn't touch them with a 10-foot pole, especially as they push this whole Christian idea. Like, they're anti-Muslim, but they're pro-Christian. And there was other factors too, that then they had immediately they have this memorial for her. Right now, this is all before the vote passes, and her husband and children arrive by boat in London, and then they have all this gigantic big screens, like it's a whole rock festival plugged in and ready to go. And you have like all these people chanting with these words, you know, like they had to occupy the human microphone, live like Joe, love like Joe. And it was really fucking creepy. Really fucking creepy. It was a Diana meets Cecil the politician death cult. It was really fucking strange. And it really left me unsettled the more this thing was going on. And it was clearly being used, her corpse was being held aloft by the anti-Brexit side, holding it in the air with the saying that if you vote for Brexit, you have put the bullet and the knife in this woman too. There was no doubt about this. This was completely the card that was being played, and it was played with the same kind of sanctimonious fake emotionality that when the press rode in behind the McCanns after Madeleine McCann went missing. You had to support Kate and Jerry McCann. They were as pure as the driven snow, and if you didn't support Kate and Jerry McCann unconditionally as the world's most inspirational parents, that was meant that you were somehow the paedophile who stole the child. And the same thing was being done with the Joe Cox thing. The same thing was being done. If you voted for Brexit, you were putting a bullet and a knife in Joe Cox. You hate all foreigners. You hate anyone who doesn't like, you know, chip butties and spotted dick and Yorkshire puddings and all this nonsense. And that's really how it was being portrayed. So therefore, this goes on, and I was thinking to myself, well, that's probably it. People are so stupid today that there'll be a huge, and even the papers in England, the media were predicting a huge swing vote against Brexit following the murder of Joe Cox. Then Brexit passed by a very, very sizable majority, and then Joe Cox ceased to exist. The same media who had been plastering her face everywhere had been in wild fits of convulsions, and the political elite, they all stopped caring about her to the point where she didn't even exist anymore. It was almost like, Her murder had fulfilled its purpose, and she was no longer required. And this to me was what made the idea of a conspiracy even more likely. Now, I'm not saying it is a conspiracy. When I say something is dodgy, that's almost like the idea of a conspiratorial, maybe, line of research may be looked at. Now, regarding this woman's sainted uh, status in the media, if you look at her and her husband, they were just classic Blairite, Brownites, New Labour types. They were just basically classic politicians, career focused, social Marxism focused, London School of Economics, influence type agenda, the Fabians, the whole works, New Statesman. There was nothing different or special about them. And the point kept made, oh, she was on some pro-Palestinian thing. Well, let me tell you about these politicians who join things like pro-Palestinians, or they join against fracking and stuff. They're told to do that to get the grassroots into the political system. They're always told to do this. This is why I'll have, Tory MPs who will skirt around the margins of racial politics, anti-immigrant politics, just to keep, dribbling a few into the party. And then when they get I can assure you that if Joe Cox had have lived long enough to get a cabinet position, she would have dropped the Palestinian thing like a ton of bricks and never mentioned it again. This is all what perception management. Now, of course, she didn't deserve to die. Of course, it was a horrific murder, but it still doesn't seem right. There's a surrealness to the murder, the immediate reporting, the beatification of this woman, the eulogizing of her corpse, and the politicization of her rigor mortis, and then finally the complete forgetting about the woman because the corpse had no longer served its purpose. Now, call me cynical, but I did not see the arm-wringing convulsions after Brexit had passed. It was almost like, oh well, that's it. Now, before I say this wouldn't happen, let's talk about, Jill Dando. When Jill Dando was initially murdered, right, the first thing they said was that the gunman was a Serbian Secret Service spy who killed her in retaliation for the bombing of the Serbian TV station by NATO. That was the first thing we were told. Then we were told it was all kinds of a lover and a crazed stalker, until they eventually settled on this poor schlub called Barry George, who was declared by the media to be an obsessed stalker fan, and who was obsessed with celebrities. And the main evidence used against him was that he had lots of Freddie Mercury posters on his wall, and he was a huge Queen fan. That was all the evidence that existed, and that man was put away for 9 years. The UK justice system has a long history of putting innocent people from the Birmingham 6, the Guildford 4, you name them, and putting them in prison for crimes they didn't commit until the thing is forgotten about, and then they say, oh, sorry, made a mistake, won't happen again. Here's the Prime Minister making an apology in the House of Commons. That's the end of it. Now, and even her funeral, Joe Cox's funeral, was not even covered on the media. It's just so strange, because as soon as Brexit passed, the entire focus was put towards these howling convulsions of snowflakes and hipsters saying things that I could not believe what I was hearing. They were actually saying things like, we won't be able to eat pizza anymore. We won't be able to get Ryanair cheap flights to Europe anymore. As if Ryanair and other discount airlines only service EU countries. What about all the flights to Norway and everywhere? This is the insanity of the thing. And this was whipped up by the media. And it really exposed just how pathetic the young people are today. That they're not fair. With all their education, they spend all this time developing an app for the iPhone, but they simply have no worldliness. They're like infantile children, completely trapped. And it's almost like the entire generation today is the IT desk has manifested as the entire generation. When IT desks back in the day, you would go down there, and they were often like Asperger cases. It was very strange because it's like strange people. They could fix anything in a computer, but if you actually had a conversation about anything else, it was like talking to someone who was autistic. And they took things very literally. This is where the whole idea of the internet troll came from. You see, because the idea of the internet troll came from just someone who deliberately had a different point of view than the prevailing message board. Because the internet was initially set up by IT nerds and people who wrote codes. And they see humanity in this. They don't think of Bill Gates. They see humanity in the same way as a string of code. If it's not perfect, it's broken. And anyone who came onto the internet who had a different point of view to an IT desk or a developer, a software developer, was broken, was damaged, because they weren't performing according to the string of code. And so this is what we saw with the Brexit bunch. The Brexit bunch, here is the story of a bearded hipster who's got tight jeans but a very small penis. And his girlfriend, she is a fucking emo. I'll leave it at that. But anyway, I could have had more time, would have written that. The Brexit bunch. The Brexit bunch. No more foreign holidays for the Brexit bunch. Anyway, yeah, so that's what happened to that bunch. And so then it all petered out, and then they predicted the usual economic bedlam and gloom for the UK, and life just goes on as normal, which just goes to show you don't believe anything in the media. It's all bollocks. And I still think that the Joe Cox murder falls well within the frame of a conspiracy theory in terms of let's look at it, let's explore it, and let's investigate it, because we're dealing with monsters in politics, and the fact that they were 1 minute screaming and howling in convulsions when this woman died, and as soon as Brexit passed they couldn't give a fuck about her, shows that the psychopathic mindset right there. They just didn't care. They just didn't give a shit. So that all their howling and convulsions prior to that was good old-fashioned political expediency. Now, speaking of conspiracies, I'm all in favour of conspiracy theories, but once again, with the Joe Cox thing, the truthers have completely missed the ball again. They go off into bullshit land. And the latest one, I thought with the flat Earth, I really thought with the flat Earth thing that it couldn't get any more stupid. Well, it actually has. Just when you think that it can't get any more ridiculous, they come up with this new one. And the way it suddenly appears overnight, spread all over YouTube with all kinds of commentary videos from nowhere, almost seems like it's a product launch by a marketing company. It's the most amazing thing. The same thing happened with the flat Earth. It was almost like it happened overnight. It was like a product launch. And then suddenly that's what they were all flat earthers. Well, the new one is, and I can't believe it. Okay, the Devil's Tower rock, you know that from the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind. You know that, right? It does look like a tree stump that's been chopped down by a lumberjack, 1,000 feet high or whatever it is. But it's not, it's a mountain. And it's a mountain that's made of the same stuff as the Giant's Causeway or the Dwarf Castles in Iceland. It's basalt that has hit seawater and cooled rapidly. And it forms something a lot like a crystal. It's basically a giant crystal. Now, the theory is that this was a giant. The world was covered in trees that were giant trees, and these they produced so much oxygen that humans were super consciousness. Now, I would not be adverse to the idea of a gigantic trees, and let's talk about it, right? Just let's take Devil's Tower before we even get to a forest. Let's take one tree. Imagine that Devil's Tower was an oak tree or something, right? Originally, it's a petrified oak tree. It would have a canopy of leaves and branches so large that underneath it no sunlight would penetrate, and it would be almost like a nuclear winter effect. The leaves falling from it would come down like aircraft falling from the sky and would crush any humans or animals underneath it. For humans to navigate under the tree where the leaves had fallen would be next to be impossible. The amount of moisture and nutrients sucked up by this gigantic tree, would basically desiccate the landscape for probably thousands of square miles around. The roots would just simply suck all the nutrients out of the soil. And speaking of the soil, any topsoil that would exist at that time would be miles and miles thick, not, a few feet like it is today. 20, 30, 40. We're miles and miles and miles of soil. Where'd all the soil go? If it was a pine tree, it would be so tall that the top of it would literally reach into space. And the amount of acid produced falling off the leaves during rainfall and precipitation would sterilize the landscape for miles. Human beings would be burned alive by acid trying to walk underneath it. But of course, none of them ever thought about this. Oh no! They just want the what the video this Russian guy has told them has to be true, and they just leave it at that. And like the flat Earth thing, it exists for one reason: they have no concept of nature. They don't know what it is to go outside. They don't know what it is to enjoy the lay of the land, to make the most of it, to understand the land, to understand the landscape, understand nature. The YouTube video is all the proof they need, because they see, nature to them is YouTube. It's not anything else. They don't go camping. They don't go hiking in the woods. Nothing like this. So to them, nature is something that happens on TV. It was Terence McKenna once said that the reason why he was talking to a man once, and the reason why the man did not get rid of his TV was because there was loads of nature programs on it, even though nature was outside. The old excuse. That's why I've always been very suspicious of David Attenborough. I always thought that his shows like Life on Earth or Richard Attenborough, whichever one is the one of those wildlife programs, that's how much I care. That David Attenborough, I think, that that those shows were like basically, homages to them of the brutality of nature. Now, I'm not saying nature isn't brutal, but it was always like the noble line. The noble line comes out, and it destroys the zebra or the wildebeest. And this is the cycle of nature, where the strong survive and the weak are food. And that whole thing of those Life on Earth shows, they were nothing more than a massive allegory for the British class system. The lions at the top, devouring the British lions at the top, who are the royalty and the aristocrats, devouring everything else beneath them. That's why the royalty loved the. I've done programs that have lost you now in the past, and lions are the scum of the earth. They're the vermin of the Kalahari. They're basically gigantic rats, and they're fucking lazy bastards too. And they always attack the weak and the sick, and so that ties in nicely with the whole agenda, with Darwinism and the survival of the fittest, and that's those Attenborough shows were really about. The class system told in the allegory of nature. Now, back to this big tree thing. They don't understand. They don't understand how nature works. They can't grasp it. They don't even think of things like, where are the roots of the trees if they were trees? And where is this enormous amount of topsoil all over the world? They don't even know what topsoil is. They wouldn't know. They post articles and links all day from prepping sites on how to grow heirloom seeds and stuff like that, but they've never stuck a shovel in the ground. They've never done that. They watch videos about it, but they don't actually grow nothing. And so they're very easily duped into believing that the earth is flat, and the mountain ranges are the remains of forests. Even though mountain ranges generally happen where tectonic plates crash together, and are in lines. No roots, nothing. It's just ridiculous. But this is the thing. It's the same thing as, like, these words that they see they see a word, and they say, oh, Jupiter, the Jupiter, and it's the same thing. Oh, Devil's Tower looks like a tree stump, so it was a tree stump. We're really screwed in so many ways, and all the while we have a real, and these are the same ones who'll post memes saying things like a picture of the 9 o'clock, a news presenter from Fox or the BBC. Hello, I'm from the BBC, or I'm from Fox. While we've distracted you with this meaningless bullshit, you've missed out what's really going on. But they're doing the same thing with the conspiracies and the alternative scene. They're all looking at mountains that look like giant tree stumps and not paying attention to the dodginess around the Joe Cox murder. What they should be looking at. And it just goes on and on and on. And, again, where did they get the idea of these giant trees? Of course, they got it from Avatar, the worst movie ever made. They got the idea from the movie Avatar, just like they get the idea of the reptilians from the film V, TV show V, and Black Goo, whatever that thing is called, was just straight from the X-Files. Straight from the X-Files. Not everything is pop culture, videos, entertainment, video games. Nothing is from the real world. Nothing. None of it. And so they talk about being researchers and everyone's a sheeple except me, and they see nothing beyond their own noses. Now, this brings us to a topic I want to talk about. As you know, I have a new book out called The Druid Code, Magic, Megaliths and Mythology. Now, a few months ago, there was this is the kind of thing. This is the reason why you love this show, is because I give you stuff that no one else has. No one else has, right? Now, there was a show, a performance, what I would call a ritual concerning the opening of the Gothard Base Tunnel in Switzerland. And the Gothard Base Tunnel is the world's largest underground railway tunnel. It basically connects Northern Europe with Southern Europe. It is a phenomenal piece of engineering, a phenomenal piece of construction, and it had an opening ceremony when it opened about a month or so ago. That was one of the most impressive and strangest things I've ever seen in my life. It was absolutely a ritual. Absolutely, it was a ritual. It was nothing else other than a ritual. Now, it was a very strange ritual on the surface. Of course, all the truthers, they don't know what Satanism is. So because they see something with two horns, they go, "It's satanic! Oh, it's satanic! It's Satanism! It's Satanism!" But the horned god idea is one of the most oldest religious and spiritual ideas in European culture. It was only made into satanic, the devil, satanic, by Christians. Prior to that, it was a symbol of the wood, the wild, the forest, nature, and so on. It wasn't anything evil in any way. It was the spirit of the forest encapsulated in the likes of Kurunos and Pan, Herne the Hunter, Wayland the Smith, and all these other horned deities that exist in European heathenism. And that was all over this thing. And it's important too because that would have been what we would have called central to what they call the European 10 Celtic cultures, Switzerland, in ancient times. Although that's one country that has little or no ancient past remembered. This is why Carl Jung had to go everywhere else to find folk traditions because basically the ones in his own country didn't exist. Calvinists and other extremist Presbyterian organizations basically wiped that country culturally clean in the 16 and 1700s. And before that, Puritans and stuff like that. Fundamental Presbyterians, Lutherans. And so it was very, very significant that it happened at that spot. And I'll tell you why. I'm not going to go into everything in my book pertaining to this, but basically according to Irish mythology, there are 4 treasures. They were called the 4 ancient treasures of Ireland, and they were allegedly brought to Ireland by the Tuatha De Danann from the destroyed homelands across the sea. These remained basically in the hands of the Druidic kind of cultures in Ireland. Now, the Druids in Ireland survived much, much longer than the Druids in Britain or anywhere else. They survived until the 1607, when the Flight of the Earls happened. They were not called Druids by that point, they were called the Field, and they were a bardic type class that performed every function of the ancient Druids, except They were always secular. So it was like the interpretation of Breton law, poetry, satires, family genealogies, and rituals. And once they were not interfering with Christianity, they were allowed to exist. But they not only existed, they had very, very, very powerful places within the Irish nobility, the great Irish clans, the O'Neills, O'Donnells, and so on. Up until 1607, we're talking about nearly basically into the time of the Renaissance. They still existed. Now, when Ireland and Spain formed an alliance to attack England and destroy it, the English won, and the final victory against the Irish and the Spanish was at the Battle of Kinsale, and a deal was made out that the Irish had to basically leave, the Irish nobility had to leave, and Ireland then fell under English rule completely. So this is a thing called the Flight of the Earls. Now, the Flight of the Earls, they all left Ireland at the same time and made their way to Europe. Some to southern France, that's where the Hennessy vodka, Hennessy brandy comes from. They were about. Some to Spain, that's where you get the Brigada Irlandes of the Spanish army. They were Spanish Irish troops that went down to Spain and joined the Spanish army. There was also an Irlanda brigade in the French military, and it was eventually absorbed into the Foreign Legion. But the main body were heading down to see the Pope at the Vatican. And among them would have been the Field, the Druids. And with them, they were bringing an unnamed treasure to the Pope. Now remember, this is really interesting, because was that unnamed treasure one of the original 4 treasures of Ireland brought to Ireland by the two of them in ancient times? Anyway, it never got to the Pope, and it never got to the Vatican, because it was symbolically thrown off the Devil's Bridge at the Gothard Pass. And not only that, on St. Patrick's Day, I think it was 1611. Don't quote me on it, it's in the book. But anyway, the treasure was lost and fell into the Gothard Gorge, at the exact spot where the Gothard Base Tunnel is, and very close to where that remarkable ritual took place of the opening of the Gothard Base Tunnel. You think that's a coincidence? It probably is. It's a synchronistic coincidence. But there's no doubt whoever threw or lost, quote unquote, that treasure at the Devil's Bridge in the Gothard Pass symbolically did it on St. Patrick's Day for that reason. Because remember, the Druids had a long-standing score to settle with Rome after Rome had wiped out the British Druids in Anglesey in AD 60. Maybe this is what they always wanted, the Vatican, whatever the secret treasure was. And the Irish Druids, or whoever it was, whatever lords and earls were there, flung it over the bridge, said they lost it to deny the Pope from having it. And yet that's where they have the ritual for the opening of the biggest, it had to have been the biggest magical ritual I'd seen since probably 9/11, in terms of its design to impact upon the psyche. It was quite staggering. But what was really interesting was the overuse of the horned god iconography, the Sarunas, the whale and the smith, the hare the hunter, Pan. There was endless numbers of dancers and performers doing that. Why is Switzerland such a strange country when it comes to this stuff? Otherwise, a kind of a boring, uninteresting place with not really much culture seems to produce these rather remarkable events. Why was this ritual performed as something that was basically a piece of engineering? Now, we do know that, like, opening ceremonies can be very camp and gay and weird and freaky and all this stuff and stupid. I don't mean to put down gay people, but I'm just saying they tend to be like that because they're the kind of companies they hire. They put on flamboyant shows, like the rituals at the opening and closing of the Olympic ceremonies, which have been rather tame this year in Rio, I might add. But yet, this thing was fully over the top, got very, very major coverage, and of course everyone goes, "It's satanic! It's satanic!" But it's not satanic. It's now a chap on my wall wrote something when I was talking about Cernunnos, the horned god of the Celtic world, and he made a pun of a joke called Cernunnos, meaning CERN, the collider in Central Europe. And I think that was a very insightful statement and comment that he made, the more I think about it. We know CERN is also in Switzerland, well, most of it. And CERN is also who gave us the World Wide Web on when? Walpurgis night, April 30th, when they released it into the public domain. And so we're starting to see the Black Haxan magic indicators coming to the surface. Now, why is the horned god so significant in all this? And I'm also fascinated by this idea of Herne the Hunter. Now, Herne the Hunter is basically an archetypal nature spirit that's based around Windsor Castle. It seems to be almost like the deity of the aristocrats. It seems to be about that. It's basically a hunter who was helping British kings. Some say Richard III, some say Henry VIII, and he was killed protecting the king from a charging stag. And the story legend goes is that the royalty, the king, whoever it was, said that if anyone could bring him back from the dead, they would be rewarded. And inevitably some kind of necromancer type, druid type, appears in the story and performs a ritual which brings Herne the Hunter back from the dead. And then Herne the Hunter doesn't have his great hunting and tracking powers anymore. And so he's disposed of by the king. He runs into the woods. He finds the stag who killed him, rips its antlers off, puts it on his head, and he's transformed into a kind of a ghost being. It's very, very amazing story. And then there's different versions of it, but that's basically the basic story around Windsor Castle area, in the woods around there. That now, Herne is an interesting word because it sounds so much like, Cernunnos. And so we're dealing with something that's very ancient here, an idea of the horn. Of course, it obviously has the shamanic overtones of the shamanic headdress, but basically that's what we're talking about. And we've seen it on the Gobstrop Cauldron from Denmark, and we've seen it all over Europe, particularly in this fascinating object at Clonmacnoise in Ireland called the North Cross, which isn't a cross. They just say it's a cross, but it has Cernunnos and it also has spirals. It's absolutely not a Christian artifact. It also looks like it's been under the sea for centuries. But that's another subject. But this shows the depth of it. Now, why do we have this horned deity? Why this horned man? Why this idea of the horned man? Why is it so integral, and why has it survived even today when the most modern piece of infrastructure in the world is being built in Switzerland? Do they evoke these ancient archetypes of the heathen forest and the heathen subconscious mind? Well, depictions of horned deities and other figures bearing either horns or antlers, they're found all over Europe and also further around the world. Now, the significance of the antlers on the person, they've been explored in many ways in terms of the shamanic idea of fusing a human with an animal and then representing that as the horned god archetype. And you have that with you have mystical beings like satyrs with the smaller goat horns. And it goes right back again, not surprisingly, to the idea of ancient animal totems in prehistoric times. Totemism itself represents, an archetypal system whereby a tribe or a group or a clan associates the animal as a kind of a motif or an insignia and represents the fortunes and the happenstances of the animal being symbolically and mystically bound up with the tribe. In many cases, the tribe claims descent or having its origins in this idea of a great animal father or mother totem. and the actual culture of the tribe sees itself as the embodiment, the collective human embodiment of the particular creature. In some instances, the spirit of man or beast would give rise to mythical creatures like centaurs. Now, you heard me talk about this show, The Brazen Bull, that I did a while back that was very popular. And then you have minotaurs, centaurs, half man, half horse, half bull, half male, half horse, and so on. And the horse was actually a totem of a tribe who called themselves the Centaurs, they were actually a tribe who called themselves the Centaurs, and they inhabited Magnesia, which is a part of northern Greece and southern Bulgaria, where the horse cult is extremely strong. Now, it's not only horned animals that have been adopted as totems. We have various American Indian tribes selecting deer, wolves, bears, buffaloes, etc. The eagle as well, very popular. And even the eagle is the animal totem of the Americas, the American Republic. In the Slavic or the Siberian tradition, you would have the idea of a totem being an inanimate object. Even things like grass, water, sand, a flowing river, a rock, a mountain, and so forth. And again, the tribe's ancestral spirit is connected to that, particularly the forest, the woods, very big within the Slavic spiritual tradition. And the belief was at death you're not united with that totem. That's why the Slavs have very similar totem type poles that the Native Americans have. Very similar. These are very deep and very common ideas. In this part of the world, we've found prehistoric tombs on Orkney Island, where objects have been found which people believe may be representative of animal totems again. Most famous one of these is the Tomb of the Eagles, which is believed to have been constructed by prehistoric people about 3100 BC. And there was loads of bones and skulls found there, and the carcasses of 10 sea eagles, which is ironic because the sea eagle actually was returned back to Ireland and Scotland after being being extinct, and gave rise to the notion that this bird was the tribe's totem. Well, this is what they believe. And finds in other Orkney quote-unquote tombs was dog skulls, songbirds, foxes, cormorants. A load of deer skeletons were found, and dozens of antlers. Now, the deer in Orkney are interesting because the deer in Orkney are genetically very different than the deer in Ireland and Britain. And there's a ridiculous theory that scientists have that these wild red deer were brought over on boats. These are a unique species of deer, and their origins is probably, as far as I'm concerned, in what they would call the Atlantis area myth, the area to the west and the north that sunk when the Midgard serpent rose up and destroyed at the time of Ragnarok, and destroyed the plain of Vigrid. So totemism is an enormous thing in ancient societies. Greek mythology has given us the Minotaur, the man-beast, and it was the first example of the horned figure, really, the Minotaur, which means the bull of Minos, took the form of a man, and he had a bull's head complete with horns, and its slaying by the other Greek, Theseus, is one of the best known of the classical myths we've all known about. It's a very deep myth. You go into the labyrinth to slay the Minotaur, which represents the darkness within us. So it's almost like a self-sacrifice. That's why I call my first book The Labyrinth of the Psychopath. It represents the psychopath in society, is what's controlling it at the very top. And we have to face that otherwise. So that's why all my work from day one has very heavily played upon the idea of mythology and symbolism from mythology. Minos was the title of one of the Cretan dynasty which used a bull as its emblem. And bulls, as I said in the show, the brazen bull, they feature in endless ancient religions. And the symbolism of the horn is strength, power, virility, sexuality, absolute energy. The Cretan palace of Kossos was adorned with frescoes, and some of them depicted young men and women leaping over bulls. You've all seen those images as well. And the bull cult became a predominant on the island. There was also a goat cult, Again, it's another, this is Black Phillip in movies like The Rich. And a stag cult, again, Hare the Hunter, so on. Another figure we all know I've mentioned is Greek god Pan. And although he was human from the waist up, he took the form of a goat down. And as well as bearing on his human head the goat horns. And he lived in Arcadia, where he watched over flocks and herds and the aided hunters in the chase. However, he had a wilder side, was associated with sexual energy and fertility, and he was accompanied by frenzied women and their drunken orgies. So he represented the feral sexuality of wildness. He was also the leader of the goat spirits, the Satyrs, which I mentioned earlier on, and who were smaller versions. They were like sub deities of Pan. And he also gave us the word panic, ironically, and it was said that he was disturbed at the countryside. He would give out a great shout which caused the perpetrators to panic. So the sound of panic used to terrify people in ancient times. And his father was Hermes, and that's another one that's a very important one in the context of this. In ancient Egypt, there were many gods who were depicted with heads of animals. Hathor, of course, was portrayed as cow's horns, and the god Osiris was bore the horns of fertility. Although originally worshipped he was worshipped as a cow, Hathor was later represented as a human with the horns upon his head enclosing a disc or the moon. We've all seen that very powerful symbolic energy, and due to the curvature of the horns in parallel or mirror image to one another, they also came to see the waxing and the waning of the moon. This is why I'm very much putting this idea of this bull cult out there, especially in regarding to these ancient megalithic sites. The so-called court cairns of Ireland were originally called horn cairns. I believe that they were part of a bull veneration cult. We see these kinds of places also all over Sardinia and other places. They're definitely, it's a bull's head looked at from the top, and the court area is the horns. Back to the Egyptians, Hathor was sometimes shown with the setting sun receiving the souls of the dead. And you also see that in the Hermes and the Saxon god Wotan, who was also the Anglo-Saxon derivative of Odin. Horned humans were not unknown to medical science, since there is a rare skin disease which goes by the name of cornu saturnium. This disease is bizarre. It manifests itself as curvaceous outgrowths which often resemble horns in the top of the head, and is mainly found growing from the scalp. Moses was said to have had this, and this is why the famous Michelangelo statue of Moses, portrays him with horns. There was even one case of cornu caternium, which was involved growths that were 1 feet long, 14 inches around the base. A famous example named, there was a guy called, let me look up his name here, Francis Tivovillo, also known as the Horned Man of Mazares, who died in 1698, and another known as the Horned Kafir of Africa. He visited London and apparently still was alive in the 1920s. This again was caused by a disease which causes these growths in the forehead. You wouldn't have them nowadays because they could amputate them, but in the past, these people would have triggered, their presence would have triggered powerful ancestral memories. The appearance of the horned god is so widespread that there was an author called Sam Gooch who suggested a very ancient origin, and his view was that the horned figure is a folk memory of Neanderthal man whose thick tufted eyebrows gave to the impression of a human being growing horns out of the top of his head. I don't know about that one, because I know that if you look at the Neanderthal skull, you see that there's a very thick sort of supraorbital bones and brow bridge bones above the eyes, but I don't think that's where it came from. I think if anything, as we've seen with the recent discoveries in France, it may well have been stalagmites that were taken from the cave. They seem to be a veneration with Neanderthal man for the geology inside of caves. Cro-Magnon man, another one of our immediate ancestors, was another unusual kind of human, and he remained apart from as a, from Neanderthal and the rest of us, and have grown up around them. Perhaps the notion that they were half animal. So the idea of the horned figure may go back many thousands of years. Who knows? Really, we do know these things last, but I don't think it's rooted so much in evolutionary science. The earliest religious symbolism of the Neanderthals are graves that were found in Uzbekistan, where they had Neanderthal graves that were buried with horns. So look, this is how far back it goes. And there's even a goat cult which exists today in somewhere in Asia, in Central Asia, that's that's derived from the cult of Burkul, the mountain goat, which is once a major religion in Central Asia. The horns of the animal are collected and used for ritual offerings, the people believing that this will, make them rich and get the harvest to grow and so on. The idea of the man beast, of course, it still hasn't died out, and there's still reports to this day of Yetis in Asia and Bigfoots in North America. There's a Dr. Myra Shackley. She even made a study on the subject, and the conclusion suggests that maybe many species of man that are still yet unidentified living in the wild accessible regions. This may have given the idea of the wild man, the hare and the hunter, the whale and the smith, etc. And remember, Swiss mountain valleys up until the 1800s were extremely inaccessible. The god-headed, the goat-headed or antler-headed or cow-headed, Mac Daddy of them all is Cernunnos. Now, what's interesting about Cernunnos is we actually know his name for the reason that they found underneath Notre Dame Cathedral a statue of him or a sculpture of him, and it clearly said in Latin his name, Cernunnos. And that demonstrates that even the Romans picked up on this cult. And they were, the Romans brought many kind of animalistic cults to the world. But this is interesting that they actually adopted a pagan, a heathen Celtic one. Celtic with a small c, because there's still so much, we don't know what is Celtic and what isn't. What I find most interesting about, well, obviously, it seems to me that the hare and the hunter comes from Cernunnos, and the connection to royalty comes via the Romans. Now, as I said, he was very heavily connected to Windsor Forest, which is where the Windsor Castle, where the royal family lives to this day. And he's almost like the archetype of the aristocrats, of the blue bloods. And that's what makes him so interesting. He's always mentioned in terms of aristocrats seeing him, Eton boys seeing him, public school boys seeing him. He's rarely cited by anyone who isn't of an aristocratic nature, or of the elite, or what they call the elite. Now, a sideline to this, James I of England and Scotland, when he was living in Windsor Castle, fenced off the majority of the woods around Windsor in order for his private hunting ground. This is like classic aristocrat. And when they hunt the stag, and he killed the stag, he was the first one, they said, to jump off his horse and slit the neck, the throat of the stag, when the blood would come rushing out, and then even more bizarre, rip open its stomach with a knife and waddle and douse himself in the digestive fluids and the blood of the actual animal he killed. And this is well documented, and it was portrayed in such a way that, isn't it an endearing thing our king does? When he kills a deer, he likes to slit its throat, slit its stomach open, and then be bathed and frolic in his juices, and then smear his hunting party with these juices and blood and viscera as well. And it's portrayed as, he was such a jolly king. He had this quirky thing he did, where this is a psychopath. This is the kind of things a psychopaths do. There was a guy on Greg Moffat's show, Legalized Freedom. I think his name is Mark Ollie, and he wrote a book about the Green Man, and they had briefly mentioned Hare and the Hunter on it. By the way, I'm going to be doing a special on Legalized Freedom with Greg for the 200th anniversary of the show, and it'll be a special just devoted to the Druid Code book. So that's why I'm not talking about it too much on this first show back. So look out for that. But this guy Mark Ollie was talking about the symbolism of the hare and the hunter. I actually think the hare and the hunter thing is more of an important archetype that's been kind of stolen by the people, and the aristocrats have taken it over. And perhaps that's what happened when we saw what the Romans did with Cyrunus and built the Notre Dame Cathedral on top of his thing, and then put the grave on top of him, and then also the Catholic Church in Ireland taking this obvious non-Christian artwork with his image on it, the North Cross at Clonmacnoise, and claiming it as being a high cross. So that's the first show back. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to support my work, well, there's a book out there, and everyone tells me who's reading it so far that they're loving it and getting an awful lot from it. The Druid Code, the link to purchase the book will be below. And I'm glad to be back. Thank you for all the well-wishers who are delighted I'm back and been so excited about the show returning. I've got good news for you. Although this show will be going out on September 1st, the velocity of now shows will be much more frequent and much more regular, perhaps a couple of week, even more from this point on now, because my job now has now given me more free time. So I have no free time to actually put shows together and talk about more and more subjects like this. So thanks again for tuning in. Have a great time, and I'll see you very, very soon. Very, very soon. And I thank you for all the wonderful messages I get, all the well wishes I get, all the people who bought the book so far. And you know the script, feck 'em if they can't take a joke.